I think use that.
Yeah, so good evening, one and all. This is Satish Simon. I stay here in Delhi, and we have a host of faculty members, students, and staff from different moments of IFAS, as well as the Tracy, that's the Theological Research and Communication Institute here in Delhi. So it's an IFAS South Asia and Tracy combined initiative of bringing in faculty from different parts of South Asia. We already had a meeting when we were helping one another understand the whole calling to look at our disciplines through the biblical worldview, biblical lens, and also look at how the discipline is not a discipline in itself, but it does have, it's a call for us to address some of the challenges in our own country or in South Asia overall. We would also look at some of the areas where this discipline fails to address some of the concerns of God or does address. So this evening we have 4 of our faculty members who would be presenting their papers. The whole idea is that after they present the papers, we would ask all of you to take notes even as they present, give the feedbacks to them, because it is a process by which we are enabling them to write into their discipline. And by the end of this academic year, we hope that all of these presentations will come out in book forms. So this evening we have 4 of our friends sharing on 4 disciplines. We have Dr. Chiranjeev Mitra, who's a physics professor, and he would share from the discipline of physics. After which we will not wait for the next person. I'm just reading the names. We have Dr. Sibyl, who is a professor in Mumbai University in the field of education. She would present her paper, following which Zoni, who is also a professor in environmental studies in Mangalore, would present his paper. And the last person would be Nishan, who would present his paper on economics. So over to Dr. Nishan de Mel. He did his PhD from Oxford and his discipline is economics. Over to you, Dr. Nishan.
Thank you very much, Satish. And thanks for all of you for hanging on for this presentation. Just let's make sure that y'all can see the screen.
Just
do you see it on full screen?
No, it's not come yet. We have to.
On the way, it's coming on the way.
Coming on the way.
Just want to make sure that you see the full screen version of it.
I can't see anything, Nishan.
Wow.
I think it's the slow network that is coming up still.
Can you share it again, once again? Yes.
Okay, let's do that again. Well, I have to just take the slide share off then. Yeah. Okay.
No. Right, it's come. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And then if I do this, does it go to full screen?
Yep.
It goes, yeah, when you do that.
Okay.
So
So
we probably don't need a full screen because then some of the writing is obscured when it occupies the full screen.
no, I'm not going to really. My presentation is just a placeholder for the 4 parts that you suggested.
Okay.
So really, you can ignore the presentation. I mean, there's no presentation, but just to give markers, it's a bookmark system, really, nothing else. Okay. So I titled it just to get us going, because economics is the subject I'm supposed to talk on, economics and the Christian. And the first, so very helpfully, I think the editors and Satish gave 4 parts. I'm going to do it is 1, 3, 2, 4. So I'm going to kind of take the parts slightly in a different order, just because I found that easier. So the first was a general introduction to the discipline, historical and philosophical overview. And an alternative could, so here, let me just begin and say a few things. I think it might be useful to look at the history of the discipline, both from a kind of academic economics and Christian, thinking on economics. And I will go quickly because this is just to give a sense of what I'm going to say, though on any particular issue later we can ask deeper questions. Okay. In academic teaching, in the history of economics, it's rooted really in the organic practices of production, exchange, and then the big part is the creation of money. Then it moves on to the creation of institutions for banking, for ownership, for production, for engaging labor, lending, then structures like company structures like limited liability, and finally the biggest one of them all, the market. In a parallel kind of history, the Christian history, I think, starts with, go out and multiply, God's mandate to fill the earth, the forming of cities in Genesis, of communities and how they have to interact. And very importantly, in the Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, sort of the stories of Moses, we see how land was received, used, alienated, and laws and ideas about them being put down, laws about or guidance or God's sense about work and rest, the claims of God and others on what you produce, and the concept of private property and the limits to that, the concepts of jubilee that come in to circumscribe in important ways how you can accumulate wealth. But also in the story of, say, Ahab and Naboth's vineyard, you see the limits of power also in alienating things from other people. So there's a sort of a different history that in how we understand the foundational things about human activity that is captured in academic teaching versus Christian teaching. And even in Christian history, there is a sense of a negotiation. It's not one fixed set of laws. You remember the daughters of Zelophehad, when they come to Moses and say why the law of inheritance to only men should be changed because of because of certain reasons. And then when that law is changed, tribes come and say, well, in that case, Zelophehad's daughters can't marry outside the tribe. So there is a sense of evolution that even economics is really a response to the way in which human society gets recreated in different contexts. And so there is no final arrival. I mean, in a way, the book End of History by Fukuyama suggests that, market economics as we have is the end of history. There's nothing beyond it. But I think that is a way of limiting how we can imagine our collective futures. Within economics, the market is also presented as a theory of utopia. It is the perfect absolute system for justice, for success, for growth, for prosperity. And I mean, there is a similar narrative of, utopia that Christians might also adopt, of being co-creators with God, of being stewards, of being concerned for the poor, the alien, and nurturing and flourishing human society. So Christians have a theory of flourishing in stewardship or responsibility to God, whereas outside Christianity, there are still similar theories of flourishing and utopia that exist that need to interact with each other. Of course, in another way, there are so many strands to economics. There's a theory of incentives and how it's all about the incentives that you set up to get people to behave in certain ways. There are some perverse strands in Christianity that sees the outcomes of economics and production as rewards of God's gift to his people, that material prosperity is a sign of blessing. I think that's something I hope not to go into, but I'm just marking out for the conversation today. Okay. So let me jump into the third question that was put I think by the editors. That's just a kind of quick historical overview, and I managed it in 5 minutes. That's great. In this third section of how does this subject reflect and address, or even fail to address, God's character and kingdom concerns relating to discipline theology, I think it's worth touching on 4 very big foundational aspects of economics. One is freedom. There, what I want to say is, I mean, I think Vinod and them alluded to it earlier in some ways, that economics prioritizes what you call negative freedom. That is, the less you are restricted from doing what you want, the more you have, less other people and the world interferes with you, the more freedom you have. And the measure of freedom is the increasing of choice. Within secular philosophy, I mean, outside Christianity, Isaiah Berlin very famously, I mean, there are theories of what you call positive freedom, which is that freedom doesn't come simply from having more choices, but freedom is something that is given to us by others in contexts that we live in. It is not simply the ability to do ability to have more choices, it's the ability to actually do what we want. And that can be a very different thing. To live the kind of life that we find meaningful is a very different thing from having all the choices, as many choices as we can. So that's a foundationally important concept, I think, that Christians have to bring into the field of economics. There's the other concept of utility. So the Christians do, non-Christians, or the field of economics does believe itself to be maximizing human well-being. And of course, Christians want to maximize human flourishing in a way, or sees that as a calling. Utility is the way of measuring or evaluating how human beings get as much as possible collectively of what they want. It is an extremely problematic way in which utility is dealt with in economics, because it is about maximizing preferences. But actually what it is that people prefer, economics is entirely silent. It has no theory of preference formation, and no theory of what it is you maximize in terms of utility. So a simple way to say it is the shrine is empty, right? Right at the heart of economics, you say you maximize human well-being or goodness, and you reduce it to utility. If you search hard enough within theory, you find that the shrine is empty. There's no concept or theory of what is actually good and what is the good that you're maximizing. And likewise, economics trivializes rationality. I mean, there's a concept of rational maximization or rational agents acting in a particular way, but actually, again, I think understanding economics well is kind of foundational to being able to engage theologically with economics. And rationality boils down to a set of consistency conditions. It doesn't mean that you do either the right thing or the good thing or the important thing. It just means that you do the same, what you do consistently, that you choose in an ordered way. And the trivialization of rationality, and yet it's such a big word that I think is often misunderstood in the world. And people think of economic claims as somehow rational, or theory as rational. And at the heart of the mathematics of economics, it's nothing but just behaving consistently. Self-interest has, of course, become an extremely important idea within economics that economics has helped to, in a way, glorify, right? And here's the problem with that it's, it is true, for instance, that we would think that people are not perfectly altruistic, and understanding that people do function on self-interest is an important thing to understand. It is and we may need to accept that empirically. But I think what often happens in the way economics explains human behavior is that everything is explained as if it were based on self-interest. And that leads to a very, very diminished understanding of human beings and a very diminished way of engaging how we may want to form and shape the world in terms of human behavior and expectations of human behavior. So I think that's another concept that has to be dealt with fairly seriously. I'll go on to section 2 that was put before us. So I think so far I've managed 5 minutes for each of these. Yeah. So section 2, what would be the approach one needs to take in studying the discipline as a passion or as a vocation? In that, fundamentally, I think when you get into any field, you have to think of it as cross-cultural mission, because you have to learn the language of the subject you're you're trying to speak to, just like you have to learn the language of the people that you're a missionary to, or you're not going to communicate. There's often a tendency or a temptation really to critique from outside, to say it's absurd, economists know nothing, they're crazy theories, they make assumptions, what do they know? But that doesn't work. I mean, economics is an extremely powerful, dominant field in the world. Almost very little happens without a defunct economist being behind shaping the idea that politicians and policymakers put into operation. Famously, John Maynard Keynes, said that the power of vested interests is highly overestimated. That it is the power of ideas that runs the world, and that economists today are behind most of the big ideas, or a lot of them, shaping history, politics, anthropology. I mean, economists have put their tentacles in so much, right? But because the power of mathematics that economists wield tends to have this sense of scientific greatness, and if we can't wield that math and the models and enter into the language, it is very difficult to communicate and to change or challenge or convert the field. And I think that's an important thing to remember as you enter the discipline. But also it's important to see how things translate. I mean, fundamentally, I would say the Christian vocation or passion or interest in economics is about how God is calling us to share capability and vulnerability together. And what we owe to God and the world in terms of sharing capability and vulnerability. That's a theological question at the heart of economics. But a lot of economic work is also about sharing vulnerability. We have social insurance, we have tax-funded healthcare, we have public goods that we create, and all of that is about sharing both prosperity and vulnerability in some way. And there's a lot of work to be done in economics of that sort, right? In the insights of social insurance and in public goods and services, and how they are developed, how they are made sustainable and kept going, and how they're improved. And so there's a lot of work that Christians can do as practicing economists, not just studying, if they learn it well enough and understand what's at the heart of what they do when they get involved in public policy. And of course, the fallen aspects of human beings is captured in economics as well, quite well, and the need for competition. The market requires you to compete. And we don't simply leave it to, as Adam Smith said, the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker. We use the competition as a way of getting people to bring out the best in them. So not to be lazy, and these are responses to the fall in a way. And the way we negotiate based on money is a way of stopping people being takers or givers all the time. In a way, you can't take all the time because you have to pay for it. You have to find ways of giving to society and earning your money in order to be able to take from society when you spend your money. And however imperfectly that works, it's a way of actually modulating behaviors that would otherwise be seen as fallen behaviors. And so while money functions as a form of entitlement, and how we can, and of course, economics is concerned about the just and unjust ways in which money is given and received or taken. The market system has some value to it, and self-interest has, the market system is a way of using self-interest the way aeronautical engineers use gravity. It's not that gravity helps you fly, but if you understand, well, we have physics and say the Bernoulli principle, it is because of gravity that you can fly with a plane. Right? When you have wings, you use the very thing that prevents you from flying to actually enable you to fly. And this is, so self-interest must be seen in that dual form, that it is a negative thing, but economists actually use it in a way to promote the public, the social good. And this is the very important thing to engage the field, not by simply dismissing these things, but recognizing the way they can be leveraged. I think somebody and so I think my time, 5 minutes, is up on this section also. But the last thing perhaps to say that we can contribute enormously usefully is that one of the problems that economists have Is it possible, Satish, to mute the mic of the whoever is speaking? Yeah. One of the ways to contribute is one of the limitations of economics is, it's based on measurement. It's empirical all the time. And so what you can't measure gets left out or forgotten or neglected. And this is, you fundamentally end up confusing what is important with what's measurable. And the things that are easier to measure get prioritized. But there's a lot of work to be done in helping the world measure things that are important. And I think it's a neglected field, and there should be much more work put into it, because the quality of our lives require a better form of being measured than gross national product. And people have done a great deal of work in it, work in that field, and there's a lot more to be done in taking that forward and bringing a Christian witness to what is prioritized in economics, right? In the last
2 minutes.
Yeah, I have very little to say, I think, about the Asian context because I haven't thought about it enough. But let me say two things that emerge as quite important that I haven't said earlier. One is that, fundamentally there's a problem in human nature, and I put it to the fallen state of impatience. There's this famous marshmallow theory in Stanford that put children in front of, at 5 years of age, in front of a marshmallow and said, we'll come back, and if you wait, we'll give you 2. But you can eat it anytime. Kids who waited were tracked over 40 years of their lives and found they were more successful in almost everything, in studies, in jobs, in marriages, in relationships, in incomes. And there is a fundamental problem in human impatience that economists themselves neglect fundamentally to the detriment of human well-being. And we do it not just at a personal level, because the field of economics hasn't learned to grapple with that problem at all. It's a foundation, and we comment it with behavioral economics and things, and we don't know. The solutions are very partial or not properly thought through. But at a social level, so the environmental crisis and all these things that we see is that we can destroy our futures for the sake of the present. We have the problem of, giving up our inheritance for a mess of pottage, that, the ethos problem is very much a reality in personal lives and the collective lives of the world in the way we pursue growth at the risk of the earth. And we don't know how to negotiate our own personal well-being against the future that hasn't been born and is yet to come. And so the question of preservation and patience becomes critical. And even in building companies, in building organizations, we reward things too quickly, and we don't know how to incentivize patience. The last, I think, thing, but I think that South Asian societies, this is why I brought it here, have a sense of preservation. I mean, farmers in Sri Lanka, while being decimated by organic fertilizer policies, 66% of them support it. We have an instinctive sense that the nature must be protected and preserved, and that's something to think about. We also have in South Asia a lot more protection of Marxist communist kind of ideas than anywhere else in the world today, probably, right? And maybe under the South America also. But there are some very important ideas in Marxism and communism. One is that structures create values. That you run a market system, you actually erode the values that human beings have, which are detrimental to human flourishing, and communist systems, as difficult as they may seem based on people being self-interested, can transform values to be more altruistic and beneficent as well. And that also the concern for inequality and rethinking entitlements. I mean, again, South Asian societies are very kind of fierce or jealous about inequality, and they complain a lot. But we are born unequal. I mean, there's a fundamental problem at the state of birth, and creating competition and equal opportunity to unequal human beings is fundamentally, not setting ourselves to have a fair outcomes necessarily. And the Marxist concept of from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, has at the heart of it something very Christian in a way, but very difficult practically. So it's also a utopian model, but I think the question of engaging Christian utopian thinking in a way with the hard ways of doing economics and the real possibilities of sneaking some of it in, right? Not that you can change economics into a perfectly Christian theological construct, but of advancing Christian thought within the ways that economics function is perhaps the best we can do. Right? We can't change it entirely, but we can make it begin to reflect more and more the callings and the sort of desires that God has for His word and His people in the way we engage it and maybe steer it through our engagement. So that's really the way I have thought this through.
Thank you so much, Nishan. Very excellent, and very, a very classic way of presentation that you have taken the entire outline and try to develop it. And I think that would definitely help others as well in their preparation. Now I open the time for students first, and then I'll ask Vinod and others too. Please do not waste your time. Let's go forward. Sashank, would you know students could respond? You just need to encourage them. Yeah, Vinod, we'll take time later for students. We don't want to lose our time.
No, it's a very full presentation. So there are lots of things one could add, but given this is just a chapter in a book, there's a limit to what can be said. But Nishan, since you brought up Marxism, I find it interesting and also a little bit depressing to find quite a few students in our part of the world who are still impressed by Marx's labor theory of value. So I'm wondering whether you should have a paragraph sort of just critiquing it.
I mean, the fact that I don't know whether it'll be very interesting to know whether people understand the logic of Marx's labor theory of value, which actually reaches all through history to be able to justify it, right? It is not a simple, yeah. So I think there are people, so it'll be very interesting to actually talk to people first. It'll be great if maybe there are some conversations that help me understand how people think about these things. I feel I may be out of touch in that sense. I didn't realize my Marxist friends are quite old. It'll be and I feel like I'm a little out of touch with how people think in universities these days.
So then just ignore it.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, yes, I mean, it's important to talk about the assumptions in standard sort of classical economics, which is what undergraduates are exposed to, the assumptions about human persons and human motivation. But also there's the other side of how capitalism functions as a culture and not just an economic system. And what kind of human character is being formed and shaped over generations of living within sort of a market-driven culture. How does work in a capitalist society actually shape our characters? So I know people like Richard Sennett, for example, have written a lot on this from a more or left-wing perspective. It's something that Christians should be concerned about.
Yeah, thanks. That's what I meant to say when I said structures shape our values. So living in a market structure, living in a non-market structure can move your value system. And I think in a way, the market structure depends a great deal on non-market values. it isn't impossible to function in a world where people are purely self-interested, and that just would not work. And
No, I mean character, not just the
Yeah.
values. I mean, yeah, where transience, lack of commitment in relationships, this kind of thing, becomes now the norm, a globalized market culture. The loss of a sense of place, sense of belonging, the community.
Thank you for that. Richard Zennet, you said, no?
Sennett, S-C-N-N-E-T. He's a sociologist, many years, the London School of Economics.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll look that up. I mean, there's another book by, what's his name, on What Money Can't Buy, and the way making something tradable automatically changes the way we perceive and interact with that in a way that is fundamentally affects our human sense of things, right? So I think this book would be interesting. I think phrasing it as character, not just values, is an interesting way to look at it. I mean, when you say it, it's clear that it does. But yeah, I will look it up.
Before Dr. Varaprasad comes in, are there management students here? I know some are here. Anyone?
Regessa, I think, is business administration, if I'm not mistaken.
Who's that?
From Pakistan.
Agesa? Albert. Billy?
Or maybe Stacy, I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, Stacy.
Yes, sir. I'm studying business
Yeah,
administration.
good. Would you like to comment on the presentation? How has it helped you? And yeah.
Yeah, it was really to the point, and where the way sir explained it, it was really helpful. And like the mostly students, like students of my class, they mostly suffer to the economics because it's a bit tough, and many students don't understand it much. But the way sir explained it, it was really to the point, and it was really helpful. And I'm looking forward more to it.
Dr. Varaprasad.
Yeah, thank you, Nishan. In fact, listening to your presentation gave me a sense that, you need to probably pitch the entire, structure and the tenor of your chapter a little lower, not so much in terms of, the essence, but in terms of pitching at the undergraduate students. I think, to me, it looked like it's a philosophy of economics in some sense, but I think you can just, bring it down a little, in terms of the manner in which the students can understand easily. That's one very general, suggestion. But in terms of the other one that, Vinod just mentioned about Marxism, I think I would suggest that if we could juxtapose capitalism and Marxism, particularly in the context of, Marxism, being imploded from within, and how capitalism has been thriving well. But if you see Thomas Piketty's writings in the last few, years, what you will find is that, especially his book on, capital in the 21st century, but of course, which is essentially, drawn from, the idea of capitalism, how this capital is actually in many ways restructuring our economies. So therefore, I think looking at some of these recent debates would add some value. And in addition to, Thomas Piketty, I think our own scholars from South Asia, like Amartya Sen, and our own JNU, recently, received a Nobel Prize. Some of these South Asian scholars who grapple with, including Pakistani scholar Mahbub ul Haq, who actually gave us, along with Amartya Sen, the Human Development Index. Looking at some of these perspectives would probably bring it to the South Asian context. And the last one pertains to I don't know whether you can define this or maybe look at it rather differently, the whole subject of economics as economics from below, wherein you have the production, distribution, and consumption being the core elements of the whole economic process. How economics from below can actually, in some ways, particularly approaching economics from the vantage point of the marginalized, the farmers, for instance, what we've seen in the last 1 year in India, particularly, of the farming laws, have been actually, changed, and then the protests, from the farmers made sure that these were repealed, and also minorities, how minorities also suffer economic, losses in many ways, because of their own social position. I think some of these things would, definitely, ensure that economics is brought closer to the realities that we've all been grappling with. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. As Vinod said, it is a bit of a vast field, and coming up with a structure that is manageable is going to be the big issue. And I think dealing with some of the kind of manifest injustices in South Asia is one approach for sure, which I would say whoever the editors are, it'd be good to have that sense, because certainly migration and keeping labor poor to make countries rich, these are important fundamental problems in South Asia. Also, that, and if you take that approach, then I may have to think about what I put into that section. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Nishan. Unless I give one more opportunity for a student to share, or anyone else, I think we should call it an evening now.
Thank you very much for, just on my part, for organizing this and kind of forcing me to come up with an outline at least. I think that I needed that, so thanks for doing it too.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. Been very thankful. Yeah. So we come to a close of our whole presentation. From here on, the